Hi, this is Barry, and welcome to the Simplicity Zen Podcast. Today, my guest is Talor Guthrie. He's a doctoral student and teacher at the Department of Psychology at the University of Oregon. He runs the Cellular the Cellular Republic YouTube channel, and it's a great channel that makes neuroscience accessible without dumbing it down. I came across his content, I think through the YouTube algorithm. Which if people are watching this, if they could like and subscribe and comment, it helps insert things into the YouTube algorithm. Anyway, I learned about his stuff there, and his content's been really helpful for me learning various aspects of neurobiology. I'm, obviously not a specialist, and I read some scientific papers, but it really helps for me to get a high level overview from the more accessible science communicators, and Talor is one of the great ones. And very specifically, the reason I invited Talor to this podcast is he works on social neurobiology or neuroanatomy, or how would you phrase it?
Social cognitive neuroscience, but
social cognitive neuroscience. And I think a lot of the evidence these days is kind of narrowing down to where the real important part of the self is the kind of the social self, our sense of self-identity. And I think our self-identity grows out of the need to have a sense of self so we can interact with people as identities. To work within a group of people, you have to know who you are and what your group is and who's not in your group and so forth. And I really wanted to dive into that with Talor. So thanks so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the kind introduction.
Sure. Could you, so you're a PhD student. Does that mean you're working on a research project?
Yeah. So right near the end, I'm starting to work on my dissertation right now, investigating the kind of sense of self within these social contexts. So we've done a couple of studies already where we're looking at brain processes that are involved in kind of self-reflection versus thinking about other people, especially other people that we know. So we have people lay in a scanner, think about themselves, think about other people, and kind of compare the differences. There's a lot of interesting kind of trajectories in the history of kind of self-science, even like self-psychology, where it used to be believed that there was nothing really special about the self, that it was just another kind of sensory thing that was being processed. And neuroscience has very much kind of uncovered that things that are self-relevant, things that are about the self, are processed in a very different way. And current research that we're doing is using a much more, I'd say, naturalistic approach. We're trying to use things in the scientific process that more closely resemble what you're actually experiencing in daily life. A lot of what's been done in the past with neuroscientific research has used really simple stimuli, pictures, words, things like that. And so what we're working on right now is actually entire narratives that we've brought people in, we've interviewed them about positive and negative things in their past.
To interrupt real quick, is this fMRI studies?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
fMRI. Yep.
Yeah. And for people who don't know what that is, that's a functional magnetic resonance imaging, and you're basically taking a 3D, moving picture of the brain and what's going on. Are you taking snapshots, or is it?
So the way that it works is that we're tracking blood flow in the brain, and the idea is that if a certain part of your brain is active, then it's using nutrients, it's using resources,
oxygen,
and it needs to be resupplied.
Right?
Yep, oxygen in particular. And we can actually see the blood flow into these areas that were just active, and it gives us a sense of what was involved in whatever kind of cognitive process they were doing. And so this has been done with all kinds of domains in the psychological field, with memory and attention. And this field that you're talking about, Barry, that I'm involved in, is a very new field, kind of bringing this social side of things into the scanner, and especially investigating the self, which when you really look at the literature, is one of the most robust findings in an MRI. You can stick one person in the scanner and tell them to think about themselves, and this really, really reliable signal will pop up in this midline structure in the frontal lobe, and it's called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And it's showing kind of that the self is special in some way, that when things are close to us, when they're dear to us, when we have some type of an attachment to something, that it's processed through this completely different kind of filter. It amps up the importance of that thing. It turns on attention. It says, like, pay attention to this, learn this, because this is kind of in some way connected to you. It's connected to your identity. And so what we're doing now is kind of looking at how people are kind of processing stories, entire narratives about themselves, about close others, about complete strangers, and really seeing kind of over time how the brain is kind of filtering and processing all of that different kind of information, and how we produce kind of a coherent sense of self.
So you talked about the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. How does the posterior cingulate cortex play into this? Is this part of your research at all, or how they interact with each other?
Yeah, I mean, it comes up a
sorry,
lot.
that a little context to people. These are both kind of the main nodes of the default mode network. And that's why I bring this up.
So there's three kind of main components of the default mode network, and that's going to be these kind of midline structures in the frontal lobe. And then there's the PCC, which you just talked about, Barry, which is pretty deep in the brain, kind of midline in the back. And then one more is the TPJ, which is kind of this junction right here between your parietal and your temporal lobe. And the three of those together kind of produce this kind of network property that's been linked to kind of mind wandering, to kind of thoughts arising, thinking about the past, thinking about the future. There's a lot of debate about what the role of the PCC actually is. But because of its location, it seems to be heavily involved in kind of the autobiographical nature of a lot of these things. It's very closely situated to memory centers. It's closely situated to kind of processing streams of information that make sense of where you are, your context, whether or not it's important. And so I think really what that region is doing is it's kind of tying whatever's going on in the current moment to a lot of attachments that you have from the past, things that may or may not have been important that are linked to kind of this current moment.
And how would you contrast that to the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, or the medial prefrontal cortex in general?
Yeah, that region seems to be heavily involved in kind of the self-referential processing. And when I say self-referential, I mean anything that has to do with being kind of relevant to the self. So things that you own, things that are important to you, traits that you consider to kind of reflect you. Am I lazy? Am I ambitious? Am I a good person? These things that form kind of the core, what I would say, and this is kind of a personal view based on kind of what I think this region is doing. There's not a lot of work that kind of solidifies this, but there's a lot of work that points in this direction, that I think that it's very goal oriented, that it's the side of yourself that's trying to kind of form a place in society, right? In defining what your core values are, what things are really important to you, what people are really important to you, that collection of things that kind of sets you apart and allows you to tell people, like, this is who I am. And the reason I think it's goal oriented is because it's situated in the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe is basically an extension of our motor cortex. The furthest portion back of our frontal lobe, that's what most animals have. We have a very extended frontal lobe. But that's the region of the brain that plans where we're going to move, what we're going to grab, what we're going to do. It's very goal oriented. It's very future oriented. And so I think that a lot of these kind of regions in the frontal lobe that tend to be involved in this kind of stuff are the ones that are maybe allowing us to make really long-term plans, which is a very unique human ability, our ability to kind of reflect and to kind of tamp down impulses because of these long-term goals and these identity processes that we have.
Okay, so true or false? Maybe we could say that the PCC kind of creates the felt sense of continuous self, and then the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the front part, is more about decision making within the context of a continuous self, and maybe the medial prefrontal cortex adds a kind of a narrative, goal oriented stream of identity on top of it. Is that, you think that's better?
I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. And I think kind of a little addition to that is I think that this ventral medial prefrontal cortex is very involved in kind of valuation, right? That decision-making process is very tied to what we think is important or not. And I think that there's a lot of that calculation that's happening there.
It is pretty much right next to the orbital frontal cortex too, which is kind of the value database in a lot of ways, right? And so,
totally.
So I imagine in some literature I've read, it almost seems like they conflate the two, which is probably a mistake. But
Uh, and I wouldn't say it's a mistake. It's a limitation of the current science. There is not a good way of defining exactly where these regions are. So you may find something in the science, in the decision-making literature, that defines it as ventral medial prefrontal cortex, but it's just a little bit different than what we would call the self, but we would still call it the same region. There's not a really good like atlas, someone that's gone in and actually mapped out exactly where these things should be. And I think there's a lot of overlap.
Okay, well, you know what to do with your PhD students in a couple of years then.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but in Zen and Buddhism, kind of a basic premise is that a lot of our kind of mistakes in living come from being overly putting too much weight into the value of experience. If you kind of break down everything, it always kind of comes down to a hedonic tone, right? Does this feel good, neutral, or bad?
Totally.
And we think we're making these Spock-like pure logic decisions, but it's really as the prefrontal cortex is kind of simulating future scenarios and seeing what's going on. It's kind of having it's actually envisioning what a certain scenario will feel like. And then typically it'll just pick the one that feels the best, or at least, or feels the least bad, and so it seems like, this region is very, you could think of this as, conceptual duality, and the duality being good or bad feelings. And it seems like, so these networks, the orbital frontal cortex and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, it seems like they're key in that process. Is that fair? Would you agree with that? Or if not, could you?
No.
A little bit?
I really like that way of thinking about it, because I mean, something that comes up in a lot of these practices, the idea of equanimity, like non-judgment, is a big role of meditative practices. And what we see is that when you're engaging in these types of processes, you do see a down regulation of these regions that tend to be involved in this kind of valuation process. Is this good? Is this bad? Is this important to me? That's the network of regions that you're saying that it gives us a lot of power in the moment of, I mean, our species is an incredibly powerful species in terms of being able to accomplish long-term goals and all of these things. But it also is one of the biggest sources of our distress also. When we get caught up in, is this bad? Is this good? And we're constantly just hyper-focused on the judgment aspects of things. I think that that's a really good way of thinking about it. And I think that it fits really well with the literature on kind of meditation and the phenomenological experience of not feeling that value judgment.
Could you talk a little bit about self-awareness, being able, self-recognition, and kind of the narrative sense of, or social sense of self? I can't remember if you guys mentioned this study in your talk, or if I've heard it in other places. Oh, I know I've heard it in other places, but I vaguely remember you guys bringing it up too. That the one guy who would put lipstick on animals and then show them a mirror, and then if they tried to wipe the lipstick off, they had a sense of of self-awareness. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think that one of our superpowers that's very much kind of refined on top of some of these other animals, like you're saying, Barry, like we do see in kind of higher order apes and even elephants, some of the mammals that have achieved kind of an extended prefrontal cortex or an ability to reflect, that really gives us this incredible ability to create kind of a secondary model of what's going on in our brain. So many of the animals in the animal kingdom are driven by whatever's happening. They're driven by the stimulus. They're reacting. And there's really two ways about going about life, right? You can be kind of driven by the things in your environment, by the expectations of other people and all of these things, or you can reflect on those things and you can make decisions to kind of stop those processes. And I think that that's a lot of what self-awareness is that we have this ability with our frontal lobe to be able to actually, like, metacognition, to think about thinking, to think about all of these processes that are going on. And it allows us this ability to regulate, because that's honestly what I think one of the biggest kind of evolutionary advantages is to having this kind of reflective self-awareness, is the ability to change behaviors, the ability to be deliberative, right? They talk a lot about kind of the evolution of cognition, the evolution of memory systems. When you look at how kind of lower order mammals, lower order animals learn and how they interact with the environment, it's all kind of trial and error. They wander around until they find something that's good, and then they learn that there's an association between this good thing and what they just did, and so they keep doing it over and over and over again. But with us, because we have this ability to reflect, we can think about lots of different options, right? We can simulate the future. We can think about things that we've done in the past, and we can put these things all together in this really kind of unique way. But that's only possible if we know that we are an agent in the world, if we know that we are a self that did these behaviors. And so it's a really kind of, I think, something that's not taken advantage of by a lot of people.
And would a non-social species need these abilities to the same degree as social species would? And one way or another, could you elaborate on that?
That's an interesting point. And so I've done a lot of thinking about the narrative sense of self, like this coherent thing that's these stories that we tell about ourselves that have brought us to where we are right now, and what advantage that really gives us as a species. And I think that you're right, that that's an incredibly social aspect. Something I like to think about a lot in these terms is to go back really, really far in evolution to kind of the first multicellular organisms. And there was a point where the first kind of animals were all just, it was a collection of cells, and all of those cells did the same thing. They were just kind of in a pack, and it was like the survival by numbers kind of thing. But there was a point where that group of cells started to figure out that if the cells on the outside lose the ability to digest and they just focus on protection, then they can be specialized. And the ones on the inside can lose the ability to protect themselves, but then can digest and spread things out. The reason I bring that up is it's, I think, a really good metaphor for what happened with human society, that as our civilizations got more complex, right? We started as just hunter-gatherer tribes where everyone was kind of doing the same thing. There was a little bit of specialization, but we were all kind of going out and foraging. We were all hunting or whatever. But as that society got more complex, there was a need to specialize. There was a need for me to do kind of the blacksmithing, and for you to do the farming, and for you to do this. And that sense of stratification within society required the need for each individual to kind of define what their purpose in society was. That I provide value to this group because I'm really good at this, or because I have these experiences that have brought me to this point in my life. And I think that served as the basis for us, like, having this process of, and you look at like adolescence and the process of development, that as you get through adolescence, your brain starts to kind of hardwire in a very specific direction. You start to focus in on identity. Who am I? What kind of value do I bring to society? And you start to get really good at a specific thing. And so I don't know if that completely answers your question, but that's the way I really like to think about kind of what advantage that plays. It allows us to create an incredibly flexible society.
So what do you think? Let's look at this from a chicken and egg perspective. Do you think the neural machinery for this kind of specialization and self-identity came first, and it created the possibilities for these highly specialized societies? Or do you think societies just kind of started becoming specialized in the people who could fit well within it were selected by evolution to stick around and participate in it? Or do you think it was one or the other, or some combination of the both?
I think the answer to these kind of questions is always that it's kind of some combination of both. There's an idea in kind of evolutionary kind of brain science that we never really create something new in terms of brain processes or things like this. We're always kind of refining what was already there.
Or building on existing systems.
Yeah, exactly. And when you look back at the history of vertebrates, like all vertebrates have had all of the components of the brain. They all had this kind of this cortex region, this midbrain region, this brainstem region. The difference is how big those regions are. And so if an animal is using a certain ability a lot, then that region gets bigger. And the thing that we used a lot was our kind of social organizational strategies of where we were in a social hierarchy and what advantages that gave us in terms of how much food we got or how much we got to mate, remembering kind of who the different members of our tribe were and remembering that we're different than this other tribe. Were all processes that I think have been evolving through kind of primate society into us now. But then there was this kind of explosion, especially with the creation of language, where now we're able to symbolically define identity, right? Now that we have these symbols, this language, we can really describe where our place in that society is rather than just kind of intuiting it through our behavior and kind of a monkey troop or whatever it may be.
It's a great point. I mean, so language is largely built on semantics, right? And if I'm remembering right, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is also involved with semantics as well. Is that right?
To a certain extent, it's heavily involved in kind of the integrative process of semantics. I did some work in my master's degree with Dasha Zaitimova. Has found a lot in this kind of ventral medial prefrontal cortex in being able to kind of connect disparate ideas. So if you see that the phone is connected to the headphones and you see that the headphones are connected to the water bottle, this ventral medial prefrontal cortex can kind of put all three of them together. Even though it never saw these two together, it can make these inferences. It can connect things that maybe didn't have a direct connection. And so what you really see in these regions in terms of what's kind of special about them in the semantic world is that they're able to build really abstract representations of these things. Whereas other parts of our brain that are along kind of the object recognition type pathways of defining like this is this thing or this is that thing, they're very tied to the sensory experience. They're tied to what I'm seeing, the edges, the lines, what purpose it serves. But when you get more into the frontal lobe and the further you get to the front of the frontal lobe, the more abstract the concepts can become, thinking about something like justice versus something concrete like an object in your environment.
Are you familiar with Anil Smith and his work? Anil Seth.
Oh yeah, Anil Seth. Yeah,
Anil Seth.
Consciousness work.
Right.
Yeah.
So he makes a big point of the inference ability of cognitions, where for perception, you're not analyzing every particular detail of an object, and crunching all the numbers and being like a banana. You're seeing some really high level details and inferring what it is. And then as you get more information, you can do an iterative process. You're narrowing in on what it really is. Like maybe at first you're like, it's a flashlight. Oh wait, no, it's a lightsaber. As you kind of. So he talks a lot about how he thinks a sense of self is also an inference in the same sense. Is this something you could speak to at all?
I think that it's an interesting idea because our self is an abstract representation. It's a collection of goals and values and expectations of the people around us that in any one given moment, it's hard to narrow down like who exactly I am, right? We're kind of inferring based on the context that I am, that I'm in, what behavior should I be displaying when I'm with my wife versus when I'm with colleagues versus when I'm with friends, right? That there's a lot of inferential process around kind of defining a particular self in that moment based on all of these features that you're experiencing. I like that idea.
And so another angle of self I'd like to hit on a little bit is, could you differentiate between, if possible, consciousness itself, a continuous narrative sense of self, and then a social sense of self? I mean, do you think you can, and I'll even make it more fun and add in a volitional sense of self. Do you think these are discrete elements that can be parsed out and experienced separately, or do you think that it's kind of all being produced at the same time and you can't really and
Mm.
they're all kind of parts of a whole in a way.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I think there's a little bit of philosophical quicksand there whenever you get into some of the consciousness realm and everything like that. But what we're seeing from phenomenological, so like the actual experience that people are having when they're in altered states of consciousness, whether that's through meditation, whether that's through psychedelics or anything like that, you can have a conscious state and not have a stable sense of self at the same time. I mean, this is a big part of a lot of the teachings that I'm sure you get into a lot on this channel. That sense of losing yourself. You are in a state of awareness, which I think is really what consciousness is kind of the highlight of the perceptual reality that we're in. And I like to think of it very much as like the tip of the iceberg. Like one of the things, I think I mentioned this on one of my podcast episodes, but Sigmund Freud gets a lot of flack. Whenever you take an intro psychology course or whatever, they always portray him as this like kook that was just obsessed with like sexual urges or whatever. And they very much kind of write off that he was very influential in bringing about the idea of the unconscious, right?
You just have to say intrinsic now to be cool.
Intrinsic, yeah, right. But I mean, most people that study consciousness now are pretty much in agreement that, I mean, as close to 98% of what your brain does is not conscious. We're not aware of the early visual cortex processing lines and edges. What we're aware of is that it's gone through this whole processing stream. It's identified objects. It's narrowed our sense of attention. It's giving what consciousness is essentially is kind of the highlights of what your brain thinks is important after it's gone through these billions of bits of information and kind of narrowed it down. I very much like to think of it. The reason my channel is called the Cellular Republic is because I think I like to use a metaphor to think about the mind and the evolution of the mind as being very akin to like a governmental structure in society. That the mind itself is responsible for taking care of billions of living cells within us, right? And different kinds of cells. We have muscle cells and nerve cells and skin cells. And all of those cells have different needs and different poles. And the only way that those cells have to communicate with the entity that's in charge of moving all of those cells, of finding resources, of allocating resources, depending on whether or not we're in trouble or whether or not we're calm, right? Is through kind of emotion, is through these physiological responses that become feelings in our conscious awareness, or through highlighting certain visual aspects of our environment that highlight, okay, this is really important because it's going to allow us to get resources, it's going to allow us to get water, it's going to allow us to get social stability and support. And
is this the salience network we're talking about?
Salience network is a really big part of that, because it kind of guides those attentional processes to what's important to ongoing goals, right? It's like, and I think a lot of that tracks with Maslow's hierarchy. Like if right now I haven't eaten in 5 days, that salience network is going to pop up when I see food. It's going to guide me towards things that are important for the survival of our community of cells. And so when I think about consciousness and what's actually being brought to consciousness, it's very much like kind of the mainstream news or something. It's the headlines. You're getting what the community of cells thinks is the most important for whatever needs to happen going forward. Whereas the sense of self is a particular part of that that is useful in certain situations. But it's useful in terms of kind of forward planning. It's useful, like if you think about a government, there are times when you want to be very progressive. You want to be kind of forward thinking and form a set of identity around like, what's our purpose? What are we supposed to do? But then if that is all you're doing and you're not actually listening to the people, if you're not listening to the cells, if you're not listening to your body and getting more in tune with what the community actually needs and wants, I think that's where more of the role of kind of these more kind of open source type meditative practices really allows you to listen to all of these things instead of just constantly planning.
On the topic of, that's great, thank you. On the topic of, subconscious or intrinsic processing, do you think the role of the default mode network, how much of it is conscious versus intrinsic or unconscious? Do you think it's doing a lot of, well, like on some levels, it's certainly, it's models of reality, the schemas it comes up with. I don't think we're always explicitly aware of them, So,
Yeah, yeah.
but in real time processing, do you think does the default mode network come online when it's time to volitionally and consciously make decisions, or do you think it's involved with some subconscious activities as well?
Uh, it's a tough question to say with certainty, because there's a lot of research that still needs to be done. But from what I've seen, I see the default mode as being a lot more intrinsic, as you would say, something that is a collection of our kind of core direction, our core values. Like when you're acting and when you're making decisions, you're not thinking, I'm doing this because I'm a good person, or I'm doing this because this or because that. Those are models that are under the hood. Your values, your beliefs, all of these things are things you bring to the moment, but they're not things that you're consciously aware of. They're filters that your decisions are going through. Whereas a lot more of the volitional aspects of things are more related to attention, are more related to actually grabbing the spotlight of attention and pointing it at where you want to point it, which is a really interesting finding from kind of meditative research. When you look at kind of the morphological changes, so like what actually changes in the brain with practitioners that have put in 10,000 hours or whatever it may be, you see growth, or their ability to fight off atrophies, the ability to fight off it decaying regions like the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So this would be on the outside of the prefrontal cortex. Tends to be a lot more involved in the actual decision-making process, and being kind of involved in the current moment. Whereas the default mode network is more related to spontaneous thought. Those moments when you drop into a meditation and you're just sitting there and all of these thoughts are just coming out of nowhere. If you really pay attention to those thoughts, a lot of those thoughts are goal oriented, right? It's like, did I take the trash out? Like, is my wife okay after the fight that we just had? Like, you perseverate on these things that are very tied to kind of your identity and to what you need to accomplish and what you want to do. And those things I think are very unconscious, but they're programs that have to play in the background to keep reminding us that we're on a trajectory, that we have long-term goals, that we need to kind of keep focusing on the environment and keep going, or else we flounder and we get lazy and we just do the thing that's the most efficient.
Yeah, when you talk about different parts of the brain being buffed up by meditation, it also makes me think of the studies that show that lots of meditation correlate to thicker insulas and less kind of statically connected insulas. And the insula being, correct me if I'm wrong, the region that kind of switches between, current moment attentional networks and default mode networks. And as the insula gets stronger, it seems like, the default mode network and its, rumination kind of loses a little bit of its power, and you get kind of more of a whole brain integrated flexibility.
And I think
and that seems to correlate to a stronger insula, and a stronger insula seems very much correlated to just raw meditation. And interesting, retreat hours specifically seems to be a more important variable than just raw meditation hours in general.
I think a huge aspect of insular growth is going to be tied to interoception. So, and by that I mean,
you define, thanks.
Yeah, no, and by that I mean inwardly focused attention, right? So focusing on the breath, focusing on sensations from the body, what we feel, how hot or cold the environment is, our kind of pressure against the chair we're sitting on, all of these kind of things. Those processes, like the insula, is a very, very heavily integrated portion of our brain that processes our sense of feeling of our body. And it's something that is incredibly expanded in the human species compared to even our most closely our closest evolutionary kind of ancestor, in terms of the only primates that are still surviving that are close to us, have very small insulas. We have the ability to have a really strong connection with our body, to reflect on how our body feels, and to actually think about the process of breathing, to think about our heart rate, to think about kind of how hot or cold our environment is. And so that is no surprise to me that people that are kind of heavy meditators that spend a lot of time actually with their body, with their breath, with all of these things, would have kind of an extended region of this brain. There's a guy named Bud Craig that's done extensive work mapping out the neuroanatomy of the insula, and it's kind of all of the nerve connections to kind of the different temperature centers and feeling centers in the brain. And what you mentioned with it being tied to the salience network, so it's tied to this region of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex that tends to pop on when we're trying to make sure that things in this environment are important. The really interesting thing there is that you're defining that these feelings from your body are important, that they need to be listened to. And you're tamping down a lot of that default mode activity. And the default mode is really kind of this perseveration network, right? It's this self-conscious network of constantly ruminating on things that I did wrong or things that I need to do, things I need to do in the future. And instead, through these meditative practices, you're kind of rewiring your brain to say, like, okay, all of these kind of reflective self-conscious processes are not as important as the signals that are actually coming from my body, or kind of the being present in this current moment and feeling the environment around me.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this might be a good segue to talking. So we've talked a little bit about, well, actually, first let me ask you, do you think there's more we could talk about of defining the self and how it, and how it's manifests through, experience and neurological processes and so forth? Do you think there's anything we could hit on there, kind of like round out that picture?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really integral to the work that I'm doing. We're trying to figure out like what the self actually is in terms of brain processes. We see a certain network of regions that's heavily active whenever we're thinking about ourselves, whenever we feel like we have a sense of self. And I think kind of rounding that out, I think the most important thing about our sense of self is that we see that it has utility in certain circumstances, but that it's a property of the brain. It's a property of kind of the processes that are going on. And the interesting thing about that is that there's this feeling of losing it phenomenologically when you're meditating, when you're in altered states of consciousness, that very kind of closely resemble these networks turning off, right?
It's interesting. I've through the psychedelic research, there's been some studies that part of the problem is, they call it ego dissolution, and there seems to be a wide variety of experiences people have that they label under ego dissolution. So it's really hard to compare study to study.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times they're really talking about different things, and I'm not sure they totally realize it. But when people have the experience where they're still aware and conscious, but there doesn't seem to be a kind of a center of continuous self holding it together, but somehow there's still awareness anyway.
Yeah.
It really seems, some studies seem to map that to kind of quieting down, how do you say it, the precuneus? Am I pronouncing that right? The precuneus,
yeah,
/ PCC, kind of down regulated, and some seem to map that to the insula being down regulated, which makes me think that that sense of self is kind of coming, it kind of depends on both of them working together. So you have the interoceptive signals coming through the insula, I'm a thing and I feel right, and then you have the kind of the back end of the default mode network, the PCC and the, how do you say again? The
precuneus.
Yeah. Those seem to be creating like kind of the continuous sense of like, I existed, I'm going to exist, and I exist right now. And it seems like when they come together, that's when you kind of get that sense of being here, right? And when that gets dysregulated or disconnected somehow, that seems to be where the, you get that kind of non-self, ego dissolution going on. If you kind of peel back the onion down to like, I'm actually here type of, that's where that seems to be disrupted.
And I think that it makes sense because I mean, a lot of the theories around kind of PCC, precuneus, and things like that are kind of about context, about autobiographical type nature of it, right? So it's taking this current moment that's coming from the insula, how I feel right now, but then it's contextualizing it in our past experiences with these types of things, with these smells, with these touch, with these tastes. And yeah, if you shut down that portion of it, then you're feeling much more in kind of the raw sensory experience. And this is a way that I really like to think about meditative practices in general, is that we go through the world with a filter on all the time.
And
And I think
is that the ventral medial prefrontal cortex?
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah, is this collection of goals and values and beliefs and everything that are tuning our attention. Right, we have billions of bits of information coming through our senses, coming through our ears and our eyes and our nose and all of these things, but we're only aware of a really, really small fraction of that because we have processes that narrow all of that down to only focus on the things that are important. And that's being done through these filters, right? Through, I'm going to pay attention to this because it's in line with my beliefs or with my values. And what I think is happening in these meditative practices is that you're kind of shutting these filters off. And instead of trying to filter the sensory world, you're just kind of bathing in it. You're letting the sensory experience flood over you. And you're not kind of attaching yourself to any component of that. You're not trying to direct your attention based on your values or your beliefs. You're just kind of experiencing the moment as it is.
Mm-hmm. Let's segue from there to kind of where it can go wrong. This process can go wrong, right?
Yeah.
And an analogy I like is that the default mode network and its emergent sense of self-identity is a little bit like the immune system, right? You wouldn't want to live without it. It's super helpful, so it makes us in a lot of ways. Yeah. But like the immune system, it has some downsides. In the immune system, the downsides are arthritis, allergies,
celiac,
celiac, yeah. too much inflammation, right? And so I kind of like to see the default mode network in a similar vein. It's like it's not a villain. I mean, it's a hero in a lot of ways. Totally. We wouldn't even be talking to each other right now if it wasn't for the default mode network. I wouldn't even be able to conceptualize you as an entity and me as an entity and communicate with you, right?
Yep.
But it has some downsides, and from the perspective of that filter, could you talk a little bit about what those downsides might be and how that might tie to people experiencing maybe not so groovy experiences in life sometimes?
No. Absolutely. And I really like that we kind of made this transition because it's a really important thing to focus on because when you get into a lot of this literature and a lot of this work, it can very much sound like default mode bad. We just need to turn that off. But you're right, it's a double-edged sword because it really is what created the ability for our species to be the dominant species on the planet, to create skyscrapers and to have these intricate religions and all of these things that depend on narrative, that depend on continuity, our ability to think about the past and future. But you can very much get caught up in that. Like our greatest strength can also be our greatest downfall. In that there's this great quote from Alan Watts that people that think all the time have nothing to think about except thought, right? You're just caught up in this this kind of model of reality instead of experiencing reality in its entirety and what's really out there. A lot of our beliefs about the world can turn into kind of negative spirals. I believe that I'm not capable. I believe that I'm worthless, that I'm this, that I'm that. You're actually creating a filter in your brain that's looking for proof of that. And then you're ruminating on it. Oh, see, this happened. I'm worthless. I'm never going to accomplish anything because of this, because of that. These systems allow us to maintain these narratives. And these narratives, the really interesting thing about kind of where this network is situated in terms of kind of brain organization is that it's involved in top-down processing. And when I say top-down processing, I mean, there's two ways that the brain kind of interacts with information. And one of them is very reflexive. It's from the bottom up. It's senses coming in. It's us then just kind of taking that as it is and reacting to it. But then the top-down influence is us having a preconceived belief, preconceived notion.
And this is Anil Smith's kind of, Anil Seth's kind of thesis is, it's the inferential predictive nature of the top-down processing of a sense of self.
And that can serve to very much kind of make your life miserable if that top-down process is not productive, if it's not kind of producing something that's healthy or producing kind of any sorts of happiness or anything like that. You are using that top-down mechanism to to really focus on the wrong things. The amazing thing about all of this is that our brain is incredibly plastic. It's plastic into long life, and a lot of these regions that I'm talking about. So plasticity is an interesting topic because the whole brain isn't able to change. A lot of things kind of solidify early in life, language and our ability to see, and all of these kind of things. But what we're talking about, these regions that learn, that develop narratives and things like this, are very malleable. You can change them by engaging in different thought processes, by reflecting. That's what a big part of meditation allows you to do, is to really think about these filters, to redefine them, to say, no, I'm not worthless. I'm actually capable. I'm confident. I'm proud. And the more you reinforce those beliefs, the more they become a part of your attentional filter going forward.
Can I
Yeah.
Can I interject there real quick?
Yeah.
So when we talk about these belief structures, these models of reality we create, it seems from a physiological perspective, what's happening is those neurons that are kind of wiring together and firing together and thus wiring together. My understanding is they develop a protective sheath on them that like kind of solidify them, right? Is that correct?
Yeah.
The myelinization, I think they call it, or something.
Yeah, myelination.
Yeah. Myelination. And so, so it's like, you could think of it as like, as water's flowing down a valley, it's kind of grooving out these channels, right? And I think our cognition and conceptualizations kind of groove in these valleys of thought beliefs, right?
Yep.
And here's why I interrupt you, because I'd like to ask you something.
Yeah.
Is so some of those grooves are helpful, like if I want coffee, there's a groove that lets me know that I can go to Starbucks, right? It's a helpful groove. But some of the grooves are like, maybe not helpful, like, everybody's talking about me behind my back, or or I'm overweight, someone who has an eating disorder, they'll have a groove that'll say, look at me, I'm fat, and they're really actually skinny. Their groove is wrong. It's delusion, right?
Yeah, totally.
And so, and so through, some sort of healing or awakening process is that groove is like, has less influence on your life. And so here's my question.
Yeah.
Are you unwinding existing grooves, or are you creating new grooves that kind of are given more preferential awareness treatment? Like how does it work at that level?
Yeah. Actually, we just talked about this on my my last podcast episode last week. This is a really hard process. I want to very much kind of highlight that change is hard. It takes repetition. It takes getting up every day and reaffirming these beliefs, because we're not getting rid of the old groove. So I used a metaphor on my last podcast that this whole process of change is like building a path through the forest, right? Every time you engage in a bad behavior, you're going out and you're putting in work on that path. You're cutting the weeds back, you're stamping down the earth and making it nice and even, until after you've done this bad habit over and over, or this belief about yourself, after you engage in it over and over and over again, you've gone through and you've paved that path. And now it's just something that's effortless. You don't think about it. You just automatically walk that path. You automatically think these things. You automatically believe these things. But when you decide to change, when you decide that you want to take a different path, you have to forge that new path. You have to step off that really comfortable one that you're on, and you have to venture out into the scary wilderness and start cutting through the brush, start climbing uphill and kind of forging this new path. But that requires work every day to go out and do that. And to kind of answer your question, Barry, is that the old path that you made, the one that you were really comfortable with these beliefs about yourself and everything, it never goes away. It gets dusty, it gets overgrown, but as soon as you decide that making this new one is hard, it's really easy to hop back on the other one. And then you're right back to walking that belief, to walking that thing. That's because this process of, it's called depotentiation, right? Neurons that fail to sync lose their link. When we stop engaging in a process, those circuits do get weaker, but they never completely disappear. And that's why
they lose the myelination.
They do lose some of these properties, but the connections still remain. And they are actually, if you reinvigorate them, if you kind of refire them, they go through the building process a lot faster than they did the first time. And so they will rewire themselves really quickly. And this is why relapse is a really big problem for people with addictions, like all through life, is that bad habit, that addiction, the kind of compulsion to go towards it, if you engage in it again, you're right back to that old neural path. It never really disappeared. It's always right there in the background. And that process of change is really hard. It takes dedication and perseverance, and it takes what we were just talking about. It takes, instead of thinking about how to just kind of turn off the default mode or things like that, we're thinking about how to repurpose it, right? We're thinking about how to create a new belief structure, a new identity structure. I like to think a lot about identity in the self and the positive aspects that can come from it when you're thinking about change, because I hate diets. I think diets are, because they have this just like this abstract goal of like, I'm going to lose 20 pounds and that's what this diet is or whatever. If you really want to lose weight, if you really want to get healthy, if you really want to start changing your beliefs or anything like that, it takes a change in identity. It takes you reflecting on who you are, right? I'm a healthy person. And so if I reaffirm this, if I have this belief that I'm a healthy person, the choices about what I eat become easier. It's not, I'm not eating that because I'm on a diet. It's, I'm not eating that because this is a core part of who I am. And that tends to, as you engage with it more and more and more, tends to kind of rewire these processes and kind of rebalance the valuation that's going on between one thing and another. But it's not easy.
Yeah, and that's a key point, I think, is, balance the valuation. Is a lot of these grooves, what's underpinning them is the underlying assumption of how it's going to make you feel, right?
Yep.
If a certain type of social interaction has been consistently, or you perceive that a certain type of social interaction is consistently unpleasant, in the value database that we were talking about earlier, the orbitofrontal cortex, that groove includes that information. Well, having job interviews sucks. You've made this decision. That's a model of reality that you have. Chances are maybe 1 out of 10 interviews are going to suck, but the bad one was so bad, you have this warped sense of reality, and it's tied. And it seems a lot of, spiritual growth or psychological growth, sometimes it's hard to differentiate the two, comes from, you could tell yourself like, no, interviews aren't that bad, right? Your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is trying to use its Spock-like abilities to say like, no, interviews are fine. Don't freak out, but you still have this deep groove that's tied to an emotional assumption that you just can't think through. And like to kind of add a Buddhist angle a little bit to this, or a mindfulness angle, is you can't really think your way out of these grooves. Sometimes all you can do is really just be aware of them, right? Yeah. And expand your awareness. And when you have, and because there's an aspect of cognition that people talk about, which is a negativity bias, right? Like negative experiences way heavier in creating these grooves than positive ones. But if you kind of expand your consciousness context a little bit, and you're paying more attention to the positive ones, what you're doing is those grooves are still there, but you're kind of reassociating them with different, valuations, where you're more aware of the good experiences. And so could you tie that process into the myelinations and, forest metaphor, where you're not so much you're not thinking new thoughts. You're learning new associations kind of at a subconscious level,
Totally. No, that's a really good way of thinking about it, because so much of this is psychological in nature. It's something that we have the ability to reflect on and to think about, right? Like you just said, Barry, like a lot of this is coming from the bottom up, this orbitofrontal cortex, this valuation, something that's really hard for us to ignore. We can't control how our body kind of feels about certain things, but we can reflect on that experience, and we can think about the long-term consequences, the long-term impacts of these kind of things. And the more we engage with that kind of a thought process, the more we're creating paths between kind of this region of the brain that's able to create these kind of abstract representations of the future and about whether or not this belief is good or not, with those regions of the brain that are kind of giving us our feeling. There's a really good analogy that's also used, thinking about the brain in terms of kind of hot and cool natures. We have a really, really powerful hot brain. And this is from evolution. It's the brain that drives us to seek immediate pleasure, things that are good. We're driven towards food and water and sex and all of these things.
And this would be dopamine, right?
Dopamine, it's very much tied with dopamine. It's these midbrain structures that are involved with moving us, with motivating us, with finding things that are like in accordance with our needs and with our wants. But we as a species have this incredible new adaptation. We have this, what a lot of people call the cool brain. We have the ability to think about all of these drives, to think about
our Spock brain.
This is our Spock brain, exactly. Yeah, to think about whether or not those serve a long-term goal. And so we can think in very abstract terms, and we can use that cool brain to kind of tamp down those impulses and to control those impulses. And the more that you engage in those processes, the more you're building these myelinated paths between that cool brain and the hot brain. And when you look at a lot of what the frontal lobe's doing is it's regulatory. It's stopping us from engaging in impulses, because it's maintaining this idea of the future, this idea of ourself. And so I think that the really kind of powerful message there is that the more you purposefully reflect, the more you actually kind of think about your values, your beliefs, the expectations of other people, who you actually are and what's important to you, the more you can build these strong models that are used for kind of regulatory purposes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to add to that, from a kind of a Buddhist perspective, sometimes you don't even need to, or often you don't even need to even like conceptualize it in a different way. Mm-hmm. Just paying attention, just the reality of the situation will in and of itself, you don't have to do anything other than pay attention, and things kind of kind of fix themselves, just because you're actually seeing reality as it really is, more than being just stuck in the grooves, which I think is a really interesting process. Mm-hmm. It's very non-intuitive, because we think well, we just I have a bad conceptualization about something, I just need to brute force a different conceptualization into it, and and a lot of and it works to some degree, because otherwise psychologists wouldn't have jobs, right? But but just from my experience, and of course I'm seeing this through the filter of a Zen practitioner. But experientially, what I found in my own life, movements haven't been so much from brute forcing a new conceptual belief, but really just broadening my scope of awareness, seeing what's really going on, and then the associations just by themselves work themselves out. That seems to be a dynamic very much as well.
I like that. No, it's an interesting way of thinking about it, because and I think that very much ties into some of my conceptualizations as well, because the brain is an associative machine. Mm-hmm. Like it's looking for associations that have some type of value for our future. And I find this with pain a lot. You're talking about that it's those moments when I'm with the pain, not trying to form a new belief about the pain, a new conceptualization of the pain, but just being with it, just being aware of it, allows me to recognize that, and without kind of saying it, without conceptualizing it, but just seeing that, like, okay, this is just a signal. It's something that's just communicating something to me. And it's my brain is learning that it doesn't need to run away from it, that it doesn't need to create this kind of sense of dread around it, or whatever it may be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in Buddhism, we talk about the differentiation between pain and suffering. And, and anyone who's done like a really long meditation retreat, they're eventually going to get to the point where you're having some very, experimentally controlled suffering there. Your knees will really hurt, or you just really don't friggin' want to be sitting at staring at this gosh darn wall, for another, couple hundred hours, So, there's some pain there, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's really unpleasant, and then you try, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ignore the pain, right? And that seems to make it worse. Or, or I'm just going to really dive in to the pain, right? That seems to make it worse, right? It's like you just can't win, right? If you try to ignore it, it hurts more.
Yeah.
If you try to really focus on it, it hurts more. And what people tend to experientially kind of figure out is you're not going to win that game. The only way to win is to not play at all. And what is involved with that game is when you add, so there's just the raw emotion of the sensation as you spoke of, but only when you add like a narrative expectation, a self-referential narrative expectation on top of it, does that pain transform into suffering. And that, and that narrative expectation is, I don't want to feel this way right now. That's the narrative. And you're creating an expectation. And the Buddha says that suffering comes from blown expectations, if I can paraphrase his first noble truth, right? And so as long as you, like trying to make the pain go away by feeling it, trying to make the pain go away by diving into it, by ignoring it, both of those are still within the context of a narrative, I don't want to feel this way.
Yeah.
But when you don't play the game at all and just experience the pain, in a non-narrative way, where you do that by just bringing your attention away from default mode narrativeness to, dorsal attention network, current moment experience, that narrative kind of turns away. And that's where the pain is no longer suffering, and it's not like totally binary, it's something, it's a spiritual skill that you learn. But that's why, you tell a lot of lay people, people don't practice, like, pain and suffering are not the same thing. That just, it's incomprehensible to so many people. But, anyone who's kind of been through that long-term meditation retreat experience kind of almost by accident figures that out, and in a lot of ways that's kind of the heart of Buddhism. Like the Buddha has in one of his, suttas, he talks about someone who's like shot by an arrow, right? Like that hurts, like someone who's like, I'm very much paraphrasing, but someone who's like a deep practitioner is just gonna, okay, I'm shot, I feel this, it is what it is. Whereas someone without the kind of practice background is gonna be like, this sucks, I hate this, I want this to go away, what a nightmare, right? And so you're actually, you're adding on a psychological pain to really what was just a physical one.
And that's a really interesting way of putting it. And it ties in with a couple of different studies that I thought about as you were saying that. The one that you just said is really interesting. There was kind of this anecdote. Doctor, he was a cardiologist. He had two patients that were pretty much at the same stage of this heart condition that they had. And one of them was describing being in just so much pain that he couldn't get out of bed, he couldn't work, he couldn't do anything. And the other one was going about his daily life. He's like, yeah, it hurts, but he was still like working and doing all of these things. And the big difference between the two of them is that one of them was a marathon runner and had kind of reestablished this different kind of association with pain, with those signals and with those things. And what we see in the MRI is really interesting because there was a study that was done with practitioners that had can't remember how many hours, but they were considered expert meditators, and they had a pain manipulation while they were in the scanners. They did something to actually initiate pain, whether it was like putting your hand in cold water,
like a hot.
Yep,
like,
there was
like a stick almost. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And what they found was really surprising to the researchers, but very much tracks with what you were just saying, Barry, is that from kind of like an outsider perspective, you think that these people that meditate have like figured out how to just turn pain off, but that's not the case. The region of the brain that processes this sensory information and processes this pain was actually higher in the people that were meditating. But the big difference is the meditators didn't have a lot of default mode activity with it that was kind of explaining the pain. They were just kind of feeling it as it was. They were and I like what you're saying, Barry, of like you weren't running into it, but you also weren't running away from, like both of those were agenic in some way. They had some type of goal, like I'm running into the pain in order for it to go away, or running but if you kind of get rid of the narrative altogether, if you kind of shut down that part of the brain that's trying to put this coherent perception together, this ties really well back into what we were talking about, like top-down influences, is that we have in our body kind of two modes of being. We can either be in a kind of fight or flight mode, threat detection, like making sure that nothing's out to get us, whether that's social or whether that's actual physical danger or whatever it may be. But then we have another side of our brain that is very much involved in rest and digest, in recuperation. And what we see in a lot of these cases is that these top-down representations that we have can turn on those fight or flight mechanisms. You can have this thing that is completely psychological in nature. You've created a fear about social environments, or about what's in your what's making you anxious, things that you might not accomplish, or whatever it may be. And those are actually feeding down into the amygdala, into these kind of midline structures that don't know anything about that. They just get the signal that like something's wrong. We're not accomplishing something. We're afraid about something. And that's kicking your body into stress responses and is giving you the agity feeling and the anxiety feelings.
It makes me think of Mark Twain's comment. He's like, I've experienced, an enormous amount of, I'm paraphrasing, but enormous amount of horrible things in my life, and some of them actually happened.
I like that. Yeah. No, totally.
Yeah, cool. Well, we're kind of coming to the end of our interview here. Is there anything you could want to add to what we've talked about, or kind of sum things up, or?
Yeah, I think that what's really interesting about all of this research is the kind of convergence that's happening across all of these different aspects of meditation and social neuroscience and decision-making neuroscience, and all of these things are all coming together in this really beautiful way, where a lot of what people have been talking about in terms of experience of what the meditative practice actually feels like, and this losing the sense of self or whatever it may be, the people like me that are studying the self, we're not studying meditation, but we came to these really interesting conclusions that really mapped on to the experiences that are being described from the meditative practice that I think are really kind of beautiful to think about. And I think really powerful when you consider how much control you actually have as a human being to be able to reflect, to be able to think about your own existence. So
cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So could you tell people, let's remind people again what your YouTube channel is, and or the other way you want people to be able to reach out to you?
Yeah, so my YouTube channel is called the Cellular Republic, and it's a collection of I am very kind of big on open education. So I have full college lectures from a cognitive neuroscience course that I taught that gets into all the different aspects of the brain. I also routinely teach group dynamics, so more of a kind of social psychology perspective of like how we manage group interactions and fit into society and things like that. Those are full and all completely open. I also do a couple pop science videos, but I've recently also been running a podcast with a co-host of mine, Andrew Cooper Sansone, called The Social Brain, where we actually talk about a lot of these same ideas, how to apply what we're learning from neuroscience to kind of real world, getting through life kind of daily interactions. So you can check out Social Brain on any podcast platform, or you can kind of like and subscribe my YouTube channel. That's probably the best place to reach out to me. But if you want to have more in-depth conversations, just leave a comment and I'll shoot you my email.
Great. Thank you. I love this so much. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I appreciate this, Barry. That was cool.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep.